Hello, folks. Welcome back to WW2 TV. Number 4 of 8 live streams today. And Giles Milton is an old buddy. We spent some time together, and he did for my money, one of the best books on D-Day because it's from the angle that I liked, which is the human story. And living in France, D-Day, soldier's story, which is in the links below, incorporated the French civilian experience as well, which is very important because they're often the voice that doesn't get heard, and also a variety of voices, which, you know, we're not going to go through every single character in Giles's book, but I'll bring him in now. It's some of the favorite stories from that book. So good morning, or it's afternoon here. No, it's still morning there, isn't it? Good morning, Giles. How are you?
It's still morning here. I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. So have you been busy with the pods and the live interviews for D-Day?
Oh my God, probably not as busy as you, but it's been pretty relentless. But you know, it's great to tell these stories. They need to. These are voices that need to be heard. The young lads going onto the beaches, a lot of them have not been heard before, and so it's great to give voice to people who are no longer around.
Well, this has been the challenge we've been talking about with the museum people we've been talking so far today, is that the torch is about to be handed over now. You know, we remember the anniversaries when there were dozens and hundreds of veterans, and now it's dozens, and it's very close to being when there'll be none, and it's why the museums, the books that share these experiences are going to be even more of an important resource than they've ever been before. But we'll bring up your PowerPoint, and then particularly we'll talk later on about we're talking with Michael Nyberg this afternoon about how France reacts to D-Day.
Oh, yeah.
But we'll talk about the Soviet and Stalin response. But let's bring up the PowerPoint, and I'm in charge of it. So here's a fantastic story, which I heard you say live in Normandy when you were filming last year. So this is an important one. So over to you, Giles.
Yes, this is a really interesting story. So I wanted to give voice to some of the Germans who played a key role in D-Day as well. And this is one of them. This is Eva Eifler. And she was very young. She was 18 years of age. She was an unwilling conscript. She'd been conscripted into Luftwaffe communications and sent to Normandy. She was homesick. She was longing for her family. You know, she didn't want to be there. But she finds herself working the very night of between the 5th and 6th of June. And her job is basically to listen in to reports that are being sent from all the various coastal stations on any activity that's happening, aerial activity, etc. So the night of the 5th, 6th of June, you know, I'm sure you've talked about this already. The weather was absolutely filthy. It was pouring down with rain. The channel was incredibly rough. There was absolutely no chance, Eva was told, of anything happening that night. So she's expecting a really quiet night. And it is really quiet until shortly before midnight, when suddenly you got a picture. She's got her earphones, you know, on. She's listening into reports coming in from the coastal stations. And suddenly everything goes berserk. She's getting reports from absolutely everywhere, up and down the coast. She doesn't know what these are saying because they're coded. So what her job is to write down the code and then hand it to someone else who then turns that code into legible script, basically. So she's not aware what's happening at the time. She just knows something big is taking place. It comes to the end of her shift about an hour later. She switches over to someone else, goes into the next door room, and realizes that D-Day has begun. What she's been decoding, or what the code she's been taking down, are the very first indications that paratroopers are landing in Normandy. So Eva Eifler, this 18-year-old unwilling conscript, is perhaps one of the very, very first people to realize that what the Germans call Invasion tag D-Day is actually unfolding. And so I felt she was an important player. Also, I wanted to give voice to women's voices in D-Day as well. Obviously, it's such a male operation. We very rarely hear women's voices, and here was one of them. And you know, she played it was an interesting role that she had.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. And we'll move on through. So Utah Beach now.
Yeah, so Utah Beach. I was intrigued actually when I was researching, you know, D-Day, the soldier story. I was thinking, who was the first Allied troop ashore? Who actually stepped onto the beaches of Normandy? The first person. Now, according to the records we have, it was this chap here, Captain Leonard Schroeder, who was he was 25 years old. He was a bulldozer of a man. You can see from that picture, he's pretty a tough-looking guy. He was very, very likable with his men. He'd trained them, really pushed them hard. So these guys that were going ashore with him, really, they felt pretty confident. They felt that they knew what they were doing. And before they board their landing craft, I'll come on to that in a second, they listen to the speech by their commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, who ends his sort of uprousing speech. He says, "I'll see you tomorrow, lads, 6:30 on the beach." And so they have these words ringing in their ears. And now Leonard and his men, they've crossed the channel in the USS Bayfield. And you've got to picture the scene at about 2:30 in the morning, and they're miles offshore. They have to clamber down from this big ship into their landing craft. And what they do this by this rope netting has been sort of put down the side of the ship, and they have to clamber down this and get into their landing craft, which of course is pitching and rocking in the choppy seas and everything. And, you know, don't underestimate how difficult this was. Leonard and his men, several of them left accounts of they're carrying these packs with, you know, they're full of equipment. They've got their munitions, they've got their weapons with them. They've got everything they're going to need for the next few days. So they weigh an absolute ton. And they've got to clamber down this netting. They're bouncing all over the place, you know. They've got to get down this netting into their landing craft safely. And it should be said, although these packs weigh a ton when they're moving down, they're getting down into their landing craft, they're going to weigh even more when they come ashore because they're going to be wet. They're going to be water. So they're carrying enormous weights with them, you know, which is why they all had to be so physically fit for the landings. So they're in their landing craft. There's Leonard is in charge of F Company. So there's 5 landing craft. There's 32 men in each. And how do they get to the beach? They've got a lot of sea to cover before they actually get into the beach. It's going to take them, you know, a couple of hours of, of tossing around in the seas. They're led by a man called Howard van der Beek. Now, he's in a craft called LCC 60. He's in charge. He's got a massive responsibility, in fact. He's in charge of making sure the landing craft land at the right section of beach. Because remember, these men have trained to take out specific targets. They've trained for specific sort of landing places on the beach. So Howard van der Beek has got an absolutely crucial task, but this is not easy when the channel is so rough, the winds are so strong, and they're coming into the coast. About 4:30 is when they first sight the French coastline. It's all hazy and misty. And as they come into the shore, obviously the German gunfire starts. It begins to get absolutely terrifying. And then when they get even closer to the shoreline, of course, the moment of truth arrives. The ramp goes down, and Leonard Schroeder, they've come in a V formation. Leonard Schroeder's in the leading landing craft. The ramp goes down, and he is the first out of that landing craft, and he leads his men ashore. And from everything I could find out, unless you've got different information, Paul, is that he was indeed probably the first Allied troop to land on the beaches of Normandy, because of course Utah Beach was the first beach where the landings were to take place. So, you know, and basically what Leonard Schroeder does and what all the men do, they run like hell, because the first point of security, of vague security anyway, is the beach, the wall at the top of the beach. So they're all going to get undercover. What happens, of course, is they discover that they've landed in completely the wrong place. Although Howard van der Beek has done a pretty good job at getting them ashore, he couldn't really predict the strength of the currents, the strength of the wind that's blown them quite a long way off course. So suddenly they find that all the targets they've been expecting, everything they trained for, has completely changed. They're in a different area of beach altogether. And I think what's testimony to the amazing training that they'd had is that they just go for it anyway. They decide, well, we're not going to shift another kind of mile down the beach to where we should have landed. We're just going to launch the invasion from here and start from where we are. And that's what they do. And so, and Captain Leonard Schroeder leads from the front. He's a formidable fighter, and he leads his men ashore, leads them inland. And eventually that day he'll get shot in the arm. He takes a machine gun bullet, or at least one anyway, in his arm, which puts him out of action. But you know, it's like so many of these individual stories. He's done his bit. He's played his role. He had to get his men ashore in safety. Obviously, some were killed, some were wounded, but generally the landings on Utah Beach went extremely well. They went pretty much according to plan, even though they'd landed in the wrong place.
Yeah. And you are absolutely right. I think he is the first man on a beach, but there is that weird technicality, is that forces from Utah Beach landed on the Santa Marcouf Islands off the coast first. 4th Cavalry Group. So one of the bits of trivia I say is the first American who died on Utah Beach wasn't American and didn't die on Utah Beach because
I knew you'd have a story like that to correct me.
He was a former Norwegian skiing instructor in the American military. He was in the 4th Cavalry Group, so he landed on San Marcos. So he wasn't American. He died on a mine there, and it wasn't really Utah Beach, but it's the Utah sector. So it's that, when he's a historian, first, biggest, largest, there's always parameters that are complicated with that. But yeah, amazing story to crack it off. And we were just talking about Jimmy Green. We moved the slides on in the previous.
I heard it. I heard you talk about him, and I thought, oh my God, you're going to steal my thunder here.
No, but I want to hear what you say, because did you get the stare with the blue eyes, or did you never meet him?
No, I haven't. I didn't meet him, and I was intrigued when you said that, actually. But I think Jimmy Green's story, one of the things that's interesting, and I think you touched on actually in the last interview with Nick, that you were saying that generally people think as Omaha Beach was the American beach, Utah was also the American beach, but actually what people don't realize is that there were various different nationalities helping out on these things, and Jimmy Green is a case in point. I think he was from the Merchant Navy originally. You may correct me on that, but he was British through and through, and he of course was one of his jobs that day was to bring in Captain Taylor Fellers and his men onto Dog Green, onto the section of Omaha Beach. Taylor Fellers here, known as Tail Feathers to his men, because he was a sprinting champion, and they left their sort of mothership, if you like, was the Empire Javelin, which they left at about 4:30 in the morning. So they're closer to the shore than Leonard Schroeder was when they're coming into Omaha Beach. And really, everything really went wrong for these poor guys led by Taylor Fellers as they're coming into the shore. The first thing that they notice is that the planes flying overhead, which are meant to be bombing Omaha Beach and taking out some of the German defenses, they're missing the beach completely. They're overflying the beach and dropping their bombs basically in the fields just behind the beach. So they're killing a lot of cows, but they're not knocking out a single German gun emplacement. And nor are any of their shells or their bombs landing on the beach. And these men had hoped that, if all else failed, at least they'd have shell holes to jump into when they're on the beach, which would provide them with some sort of cover. And they realize it's sort of this dawning horror that they're actually going to be in real serious trouble. And Jimmy Green, who's a pretty experienced guy, veteran, he also is extremely anxious for these young guys that are going to be going ashore. Now, the other thing that really alarms them is that they realize as they're in their landing craft coming into the shore, they overtake the amphibious tanks that are meant to have come in, just before them or at the same time as them to give heavy armored support as they come into land. And this is another significant, in fact, it's a massive blow to them, because they suddenly realize, well, not only have we got no cover at all, the German defenses haven't been unscathed, but also, we're going to have no heavy gun support when we arrive on that beach. And so the descriptions I read of them coming ashore, they're pretty different. And I'd be interested to get your take on this as well, because, everyone's familiar with the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan and all that stuff. And they come ashore and it's carnage and it's mayhem and, it's horrible, basically. There's just machine gun fire, shells, everything's going off all over the place. But the story I unearthed with Taylor Fellers and his men is slightly different. That they actually, when they landed, there was no gunfire at all. And it was only once they were on the beach and completely vulnerable and exposed that the German guns opened up. And it was absolute carnage at that point. And actually, one of the stories I uncovered, because I wanted to tell, when I was writing my book, I wanted to tell the story, obviously, of the men coming ashore, but also the story of the men in the German bunkers and machine gun, placements and everything, what they were doing and feeling and everything. So there's a story of Karl Wegner, who was in WN 72, so pretty close to where these guys were coming ashore. And he's a young conscript. He was an unwilling conscript, didn't want to be there, and he's pretty, I don't know, he's. If you believe his account, he was deeply unsettled by just sitting there in front of his machine gun and basically mowing these young guys down who are the same age as him, So it was a complete wipeout for Taylor Fellers and pretty much all his men are wiped out on the beach. They're just taken out there and then. And when a later wave comes in, the famous account by Hal Baumgarten, he describes the scene when he comes ashore slightly later, and there's just basically corpses all over the beach. Taterfellas and his men have been totally butchered.
And you're absolutely right. There was a gap. And part of the ramp, as the ramps went down, although on other parts of the beach there was immediate gunfire on them, on that part of Dog Green, the machine guns are in range kind of halfway across the beach. So as they got out, and it was still low tide, as they moved forward, when they got to that part of the beach where the machine guns are ranged, that's when it opened up. So there was these, whether it was seconds, whether it was minutes, whether it was multiple minutes, time would move differently for the people witnessing this, Jimmy Green, the others. But there was definitely a gap. Saving Private Ryan, I guess for narrative purposes, just went straight from ramp to machine gun fire immediately. But there was this sort of strange gap in the middle, which is fascinating. And Hal Baumgarten, I knew really well. His widow's over here in Normandy this week, but I haven't got a chance. I don't think I'll get a chance to meet. Apparently, I found out this week she had a crush on me, which is extraordinary. But that's another story for another day, folks. Having a American veteran's widow having a crush on you. But we must move now to Franz Gockel, because we have so few voices from the German side of D-Day, and then there's a whole thing about the fake German voices of D-Day, which is another rabbit hole we're going to go to. But Franz Gockel, who I also met a couple of times, solid storyteller and unembellisher. So share his story with us, Giles.
Yeah, he left a lot of accounts. He left letters, he left sort of diary extracts, but also he actually wrote a book about his experience. And I'm really astonished that his book is available in German and it's available in French, but it's never been published in English. And I think it's a real crying shame for the story of D-Day, because Franz Gockel was, I suppose he's the voice probably of the ordinary German soldier, in the sense that he was an unwilling conscript. He was on D-Day. He just turned 18. He was very homesick for his family. Absolutely didn't want to be there. I read all his letters to his mother. He was also a very believing Catholic, and he was very worried about the idea of shooting men, of gunning them down on the beaches. Very uncomfortable with this idea. And his story is very interesting because he sets out the period before D-Day as well, when he's on Omaha Beach. His strong point is WN62. And, Rommel comes on an inspection visit early in the year. I think it was late January, when Rommel came around and just looked at the defences and said, lads, this is not good enough. And he sets Gockel and his comrades to work, along with a lot of French civilians who are forced to do pretty heavy work on the beaches, sticking in, the Rommel's asparagus, the poles that are going to be topped with mines, and all sorts of defences, trenches that were being built in the bluffs just behind Omaha Beach. And so Gockel sets all this out. He sets out the camaraderie with his fellow German soldiers. It's fascinating stuff. But basically, he also sets out that life is really boring for a lot of the time, because he sits there staring out to sea, waiting for the Allied fleet to come, because they all know that D-Day is going to happen. They all know that the Allies are coming. They just don't know when, and they don't know where they're going to land. Yeah. But they suspect, I think, and certainly if Rommel is to be believed, he suspected that Omaha Beach was a sort of classic sort of beach where the Western Allies would land, because it's exactly the sort of beach where they landed on Sicily. So that gave him some idea that this is a beach where they're going to land, and this is why they need to strengthen the defences. And so Gockel, we have his story from the morning of D-Day, where he's in his machine gun nest, which we've actually been to together. It's still sort of vaguely there, isn't it? It's all a bit overgrown these days, and brambles and everything, but you can still by sort of going into that little bunker place and all concrete and everything, you still get some idea of what it was like for a young 18-year-old to be looking out, staring out over the beach, waiting for the Americans to arrive. And then, as Gockel describes, well, what we have to do now when they're ashore, we simply have to mow them down with our machine guns. And boy, were they, it's a horrible word to use, but were they successful in doing that, because they caused a complete wipeout in the early waves. The other comrade who some people would know is Heinz Severloh, who wrote, and I think his book is pretty controversial, but he was with Franz Gockel there in WN62. and again sets out pretty much the full horror of.
And it's the opposite of Franz's, because Severlow's is full of exaggeration and the legend built around it, and the English edition is slightly different to the German edition. And of the two, as a historian myself, the Gockel account has far more validity and honesty and humility and all the things you require than the Severlow account that just at various points reeks of exaggeration and hyperbole and historians putting their own 2 cents in. And Franz Gockel just had a solid, maybe a slightly less exciting account, but all the better for it, because he just stuck to the facts, ma'am, as Dracula would say. So
I didn't really use Severlow's account in my book because for exactly those reasons. I much preferred Franz Gockel. And just to follow his story through that day, of course, eventually the Americans get ashore and they begin to advance. And Gockel and his mates, they find themselves pretty much surrounded. And then he gets a wound, a bullet in his hand, I think it was. And this was known as a Heimatschuss, which is a home for shore wound. It meant he was out of action. D-Day for him was over. And just one thing, Paul, on the Germans on D-Day, because my German father-in-law was in Normandy for D-Day, and so I got to talk to him about it as well. And he was really interesting. First of all, he was a funker, so he was a wireless operator, which meant that he had to get really close to the landing Allied forces to be able to report back where they were and what they were doing. So the story he recounted to me was very interesting, but also from the point that him and his mates, all unwilling conscripts, I should say, all they wanted to do was give themselves up because they knew the war was lost, and they wanted to give themselves up. But it was incredibly dangerous because if you were caught by your commanding officer, you'd be immediately shot. So it took him some days before he was able to give himself up as a prisoner. Now, why did he know the war was lost on D-Day? Because he'd been on the Eastern Front. And although he'd got very ill with diphtheria, so he hadn't faced the full fury of the Eastern Front. But he'd seen enough to realize that what the Western Allies, what the Americans, British, Canadians, the amount of firepower, the amount of weaponry that they were able to bring into Normandy, it outsmarted anything that was taking place on the Eastern Front. And they knew, my God, if they can bring this stuff in, in the opening hours of D-Day, this war is lost for us. At which point they all want to save their skin, get captured, become prisoners of war, and survive the war, get out of it alive. So he gave himself up. He was a prisoner of war, first in England, and then spent the next 2 years in America.
Brilliant stuff. So we're moving to Juno Beach, the Dalton brothers.
Juno Beach. When I was doing, researching the book, I felt always, and you probably feel the same about this, that Juno slightly gets written out of the story. The poor Canadians, everyone talks about the Americans, particularly American historians. Everyone talks about the Brits, but what about Juno Beach? So I went to the archives in Canada to really try and give them their equal share. And the story I just wanted to highlight here was the story of two brothers called Charles and Elliot Dalton, both majors. They're both in the Queen's Own Rifles Cadet Company, and they're both going to be going ashore at Bernier-sur-Mer. Now, Charles was the older of the two, who was 33. He is the one on the left of the picture there. He was really worried for his dear old mother. He thought, what if we both go ashore and we both get killed? Our mother, she's never going to survive that, So he begs his commanding officer that only one of them go ashore on D-Day. Commanding officer says, don't be ridiculous. That's out of the question. You're both going ashore. And so they both land. They're both great leaders of men. But, it was a pretty bloody assault that they faced coming into Bernier-sur-Mer, because you've got to imagine, and I think people often forget this, that the coastline of Normandy is dotted with towns and villages, and where the troops came ashore in these sort of semi-urban areas, if you like, the Germans had turned every house, every window into a machine gun emplacement, basically. So it made it extremely dangerous for the men coming ashore. And sure enough, these two men come ashore and Charles is wounded. He gets a bullet through his helmet, which happily misses his brain, but it skims his skull, tears the top of his head open, and he's out of action. Elliot doesn't know that he's sent back to, he's hospitalized, sent back to England, where he will spend the next few weeks in hospital. Elliot doesn't know this at the time, but it's a few hours or maybe even a day or so later when he realizes his brother has been, well, he's told his brother's been killed. So he's absolutely mortified. They're very, very close, these two brothers. He's mortified when he learns this. He fights like a complete lunatic for the next few days because he's so sort of wound up and distressed at the thought he's lost his brother. And eventually he also is wounded and has to be hospitalized. So he's shipped back to Portsmouth as well. And the nurses wheel him to a bed which is marked Major Dalton. And when they're about to get him into the bed, and they realize that there's someone else in the bed, and they say, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm Major Dalton." And it's actually Charles is in the bed that has been reserved for Elliot. And it's a wonderful story because it's a point where the two brothers who love each other dearly, one thinks the other's dead, they're reunited, both alive, and both just delighted to have found each other again.
What an amazing story. And and thank you for doing what your book does. And again, folks, support Giles by buying the book, support me by watching the channel, because it's that human interest. Because sometimes DDay can get all a bit, this number of ships, this number of aircraft, this number of bombs, this number of, and it brings it down to the personal stories. And let's move to Sword Beach, where my great uncle was.
Oh, really?
And another incredible photo and an incredible story. Back to you.
Yeah, well, and we'll move on to the next photo as well in a minute, but let's pause on this one because this is the story I was telling of Lionel Roebuck, who was with the East Yorks Regiment. So he was one of the first people to land on Sword Beach. And you know that the men, as we know, they'd been through a lot of training for D-Day. They'd gone through simulated landings. They'd done all sorts of live fire training, etc. So a lot of them really felt they were as ready as they could ever be. Lionel Roebuck was one of the few voices where he said, "I didn't feel I was ready for this. I don't feel we've done enough training." And he says, which I was surprised by, that him and his men had never done a simulated landing. So this was coming new to them. If that's right in his account, then this was the first time round for them, you know. And he describes in his account it being in the landing craft and just being sort of pitched around violently in the seas. Now they'd eaten a stew and tons of chocolate overnight, which was probably the worst thing to have eaten when they're pitching around in this violently choppy seas. They then had a cooked breakfast, and they're feeling pretty dreadful by the time they come ashore. And when they come ashore, of course, they're met by a barrage of sustained German machine gun fire, and many of Lionel's friends are simply machine gunned to death in the early minutes of landing on Sword Beach. And to pick up his story, if we can go on to the next slide, because this is actually, I think, one of the most interesting accounts I came across. Cliff Morris, who was a commando, so he's going in slightly later on Sword Beach, and he wrote a diary called, as you can see there on the screen, "United We Conquered, the Diary of a Commando Soldier." And here you can see he's drawn a picture of his landing craft, which is landing craft 503. And there's a few, it's so brilliantly written because it's so vivid. It gives a real flavor of what it was like to be first of all, to be in the Channel that night. So as Lionel had said, they'd all eaten this food. Then they were violently seasick. I mean, and I really mean violently seasick. They felt absolutely terrible as they were crossing the Channel. And Cliff Morris and his mates, you know, highly trained commandos, they're wondering how the hell they're going to fight the Germans when they feel so utterly awful. Then he describes coming into the shoreline. So as first light breaks, they see the French coastline. They get closer, and then the machine guns open up. The big German guns open up. He describes the landing craft next to him being hit by a German shell. It's blown to pieces. Body parts rain down on him. It's pretty, you know, horrific stuff, and he doesn't hold back when he describes this. One of the things he says in his diary, this is quite extraordinary. This is about an hour before they come into shore. He says, "The sergeant major came around rousing us, and under his eagle eye, he said, every man was told to wash, shave, and clean his boots. He said," this is the sergeant major, he said, "if it was the last thing we did, we should go in spick and span." I mean, that's absolutely extraordinary.
Priorities, yeah.
Priorities, right? Yeah, exactly. So they come into the shore. The shoreline is there's fires on the shoreline. There's shells going off everywhere, and then the moment of truth. And this is, I think, the moment for every single soldier landing on D-Day that morning. The horrific moment when the ramp goes down. You know. And you're facing reality, the reality of a heavily defended Atlantic wall. And he runs up the beach, and listen to this, because he describes just what had happened to Lionel Roebuck and his men an hour or so earlier. He says, bodies lay sprawled all over the beach, some with legs, arms and heads missing, the blood clotting in the wet sand. All this and the moans and screams of those in agony blended with the shriek of bullets and the whining of shells. It was terrifying. And I think for him and the survivors of that, you know, it really was horrific to see the carnage that had taken place in the first wave who'd gone ashore. Now, I think it was Lord Lovat, the commander of the commandos, one of his, you know, immortal phrases was, "He who hesitates is lost." And certainly none of the commandos hesitated that morning. They got up the beach as quickly as they could. They started taking out the German gun emplacements and rendering the beach safe for those who are coming in behind. Because, you know, you've got to realize, if you take out one machine gun emplacement, you've effectively made one area of beach safe for the men coming in behind you. So that was really the story of Cliff Morris. I put quite a lot about him in the book because I had rarely come across an account that was so sort of visceral, so in your face. You really felt you're there with him in the horror. And that's good. To go back to Saving Private Ryan again, I don't think Spielberg could have showed on screen just how horrific it was, and particularly the screams of the men who are just lying there with, you know, no painkillers or anything. They're lying there in their own blood. And
it's a very good point about the lack of visceral accounts, which is understandable. But, you know, I'm in the process of researching my next book, and you get like 8 accounts of a battle, and 5 or 6 are maybe quite pedestrian. It just, I can use this, but it's not really got that kind of vivid sense of being there. Then you get that one where the person is just opening up and talking about the whizzing of bullets and this, and you go, okay, that's the one that will be used more, and then you use the other accounts perhaps to flesh out the detail. But I like the fact, sorry.
And no, and Paul, you're making a really important point, because also with Cliff Morris, you see, he was writing his diary at the end of every day, which gives it a freshness, which, you know, sometimes, I mean, the veterans have all got their stories and everything, but many of them have told them many times. And you know, the ones who are surviving now are very, very old. And memories get, you know, we all see how people get as they get older. And so to go back to accounts that were written at the time, so diaries that were written at the time, and letters home and everything, they have a vividness to them that you just don't get in old men talking about their stories.
And they sound like a young person talking, whereas veterans, when they tell the stories now, they're filtered through the lens of looking back from 80 years beyond, which is fantastic, but it doesn't necessarily give that. There's a distance now. It's because they're being reflective and contemplative, and they're thinking about, but at the time they're thinking about, will I live through tomorrow? And so there's, you know, accounts come in all different shapes and sizes. And I like the fact you've taken us from the intense, busy, massive drama of the beaches to our next story, which couldn't have occurred in a quieter kind of backwater, in a sense, of the darkened hedgerows of the Cotentin Peninsula. So Malcolm Brannan's story, which some people will be familiar with, but some won't.
Yeah, I mean, his story is fascinating because it sort of shows what went right with the airborne landings and what went wrong with them.
Yeah.
What went wrong with them is that the men were widely scattered all over the countryside. They landed, they hadn't got a clue where they were. They'd lost all their mates. They didn't know where their objectives were. And in one sense, they were a complete disaster. In another sense, what went right about them is the Germans are scratching their heads thinking, what the hell are the Americans doing? What is this all about? They hadn't got a clue. Now, why Malcolm Brannan's story, I think, is so interesting, is that, like so many of the well-trained airborne troops, is that he's sort of unfazed by the fact he's lost most of his men, doesn't know where he is. What he does is gather together an impromptu band, and they decide to work out where they are and what they're going to do, because they've got their weapons with them and everything, and they want to get cracking on this operation. So they eventually came to a farm, which the two of us have actually visited together. Last year or whatever. I think it's the Ferme de la Minoterie. It's a farm in the middle of the countryside. They knock on the door in the early hours, and basically they say to the farmer, "Where the hell are we? Can you help us? Here's our map. Show us where we are." And as they're talking to the German farmer, they hear the sound of a car. And they think one thing: this car traveling at this time of night has to be somebody important. And they know that from the French farmer that there's a German headquarters nearby. Sure enough, the car is coming closer and closer, and they are getting into position with their guns on either side of the road. And as the car comes into sight, it is, of course, a German staff car. It has got Lieutenant General William Falley inside it, an important German general, who's not been at his post that night, like so many of the generals. They thought there's no way the Allies were coming on that night, so they were not at their post. And he's now realizing that the Allies are coming. He's rushing back in his staff car to headquarters. What do Malcolm Brannan and his men do? They ambush him and they open fire with their guns. The car crashes into the wall of the farmhouse, and basically, to cut a long story short, William Falley is killed. He's dead. He's the only German general who is actually going to be killed on D-Day, and Malcolm Brannan has claimed his scalp. And I think you met him, so you might be able to add more to that story.
I knew his daughter. I knew Jack Schlegel, who was in the follow-up thing. And folks, we're talking about with Niels this afternoon about the 91st Air Landing Division, which is the unit that General Falley commanded. So we'll bring it all with the German perspective of the repercussions of this loss of a commanding officer this afternoon with Niels. But I want to turn to your show and tell later, and I want to turn to Stalin, because we'll perhaps just do this. We'll do Len Lamel's story. Again, I don't want to name drop, but I met Len a couple of times as well. And my memory of Len, before I let you tell your story, is not entirely positive, because I made the mistake, I was about 19 or 20, of mentioning the Longest Day film to him. And he rather brusquely told me that he and his buddies hated that movie. And I just about managed to squeeze out, "Why didn't you like the movie?" And he said two words, and they were Paul Anka. I kind of, my first encounter with Len Lamel was terrifying. But I'll hand you over to him, and of course, an absolute legend.
I'll keep these ones very brief because we're going to run out of time otherwise. Leonard Lommel, so he's at Pointe du Hoc. Famously, the Americans have got to climb up the cliffs, scale the cliffs, and knock out the big German guns. Yeah. The story of climbing the cliffs is a story in itself. They get to the top. The guns aren't there. These big guns that could have threatened Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, powerful guns. They could have fired on the battleships out at sea. The guns aren't there, and they're pretty horrified. They've missed their target. But Leonard Lommel, he's sure they must be somewhere. He goes inland, and to cut to the chase, they find the guns, him and a mate. They put thermite grenades onto the working mechanisms of the guns, and they knock them out of action. So a big story, an important story in D-Day, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And the next one is, is another absolute favorite of mine. I quote him on my tours because we're talking about another person who bloody well wrote well, and with humor as well. Stan Scotty Scott, yeah, and I'm just finding a thing so he wrote or actually gave quite a lot of audible interviews and everything. And he had to get to Pegasus Bridge. That was his task, is get to Pegasus Bridge to relieve John Howard's men and the other men who are holding the bridge at that time. And here's just his description as they're on their bikes cycling towards the bridge. He says, rounds were hitting from all sides. There was rounds ricocheting off and splatting and hitting. Campbell's just the unlucky one. He got clobbered. He got hit through the neck, fell down in one big lump, him, the bike, and all that. And he describes arriving at Pegasus Bridge. And, talking of the Longest Day, people will be familiar with the famous scene of Lord Lovett and everything. And it's all bagpipes playing and all that stuff. And can I swear on this? Am I allowed to swear? Yeah.
Okay. Because Stan Scotty Scott, when he arrives at the bridge, he's met by a wounded British parachute guy who just looks at him and just says, "Where the fuck have you been?" Yeah. And I think that rings a lot truer than some of the stories that eventually made their way into the Longest Day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, an amazing story. And Neil Barber's included his account in his book as well, and you in your book. And yeah, Stan, and he's just got that face of a guy who you'd listen to in the pub, isn't he? And I think that way he wrote and the way he did the interviews is fantastic. But Ernie Pyle, when we're talking about the use of words, Giles, as a wordsmith yourself, I mean, Ernie Pyle,
Yeah.
I mean,
he's brilliant, but also he was very unusual, I think, for his time, because what interested Ernie Pyle as a war correspondent was the human interest stories, basically. Yeah. So he, wherever possible, he tried to interview just, normal soldiers, normal conscripts, whatever, and get their stories. And, his reports vividly bring to life tales from the battlefield, not just on D-Day, of course. He covered North Africa, he'd covered Italy as well. So, he walked down the beach of Omaha on the evening of D-Day, and just a couple of lines from his report, because they're very poignant. He writes, "As I ploughed out over the wet sand of the beach on that first day ashore, I walked around what seemed to be a couple of pieces of driftwood sticking out of the sand. But they weren't driftwood, they were the legs of a dead GI soldier. And he said he was completely covered by the shifting sands except for his feet. The toes of his GI shoes pointed towards the land he'd come so far to see, and which he saw so briefly." A very poignant testimony to the bloodshed that had taken place on Omaha, and of course on the other beaches as well.
Yeah, and we could do a whole big report about the effect it had on Ernie Pyle, and as a person, we've got in fact a show on the channel about Ernie Pyle with a biographer about all the demons and things he was dealing with. But we'll thank you very much for some fantastic presentations. But you've got a show and tell to do, and then we'll talk about Stalin. Let's do your.
Yeah. So show and tell, actually, I have to say, when I was like a 7-year-old kid, when I went to the Normandy beaches, there was still rusting barbed wire on the beaches at that point. And I remember snapping a piece off, and that was my show and tell at primary school. And boy, that was a good one. So my passion for D-Day goes back a long way. But look at this. I'm going to hold it up, and I hope that people can see it. This is a newspaper that my grandfather bought on, well, actually, it's of course dated the 7th of June. But this is a report of the D-Day landings, the Daily Express. 10 miles inland, it says. Well, that was not strictly speaking true, but never get a good story get in the way of the truth. It says it all goes well. Invaders are digging in on a broad front. First losses are much fewer than had been expected. Well, losses were still pretty high. Maybe they were less than had been expected, but this gives an overwhelmingly upbeat account of the D-Day landing. So fascinating. I just wanted to show people who are watching. I thought they might be interested. There's a map at the bottom there showing the 5 arrows of the men going in.
And the map at the bottom, when they don't really know where anyone's going. No one's really got. It's like, well, we kind of landed somewhere in France and we're heading vaguely inland somewhere. But the poor press are dealing with the limited amount of information they're being told. But I
love Paul the vivid account of the journalist. You think, bloody hell, they're going up the beaches with the troops. Well, actually, no, they're on the battleships. They're describing what they think is happening.
A few of them are inland, but a lot of them are, in the wardroom having. But anyway, your latest book is all about the Churchill and Stalin and their relationship and the ever complicated relationship the Allies have with its allies. And so, we're commemorating as English speakers the incredible significance of June the 6th as one of those. I don't like the phrase turning points, but what the hell, it's D-Day. We can use it. It is a turning point. But for Stalin, what was his reaction?
So Stalin had been demanding a second front for pretty much since 1941, since Operation Barbarossa. He was constantly begging, really, Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt to launch the second front. But Roosevelt and Churchill always held back. They felt they were not ready to do this. And so it was very interesting to read about Stalin's reaction. So the British ambassador, Archie Clark Kerr in Moscow, informed Stalin on the night of D-Day, so late on the 5th of June, that D-Day was finally happening. And, Stalin and his generals, for the previous 2 years, they treated crossing the English Channel as if it was little more difficult than crossing the River Volga. They didn't treat it seriously. And what happened in the aftermath of D-Day, an American general was flown over to Moscow with footage that had been shot on D-Day itself. They showed this to Stalin and his commissars, and they were absolutely amazed. They had no idea of the scale and complexity of the D-Day landings. They really couldn't believe what they're watching. And Stalin was effusive in his praise, saying that this is one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of warfare. He really went overboard. But Stalin also realized he now had a problem on his hand, because there was going to be a race to Berlin, and he wanted the Red Army to get there first. He wanted the ultimate prize. So while D-Day was in some senses welcome to the Soviets, it also presented a challenge. Who was going to get to Hitler's crumbling capital first? The race was on.
Well, that is a very enticing setup for you to come back in the future and carry on more about that and Stalin and his the complicated relationship he had. But Giles, we will leave things there. It's been absolutely smashing talking to you, and we have spent some time together in Normandy, and we have ways and things like that. And I hope our paths cross again. And reminding us it's about people. D-Day is about people, and just some of them are talked about today, but many more in your book. And again, I said it in my introduction, Mag, my other half, who's at the American Cemetery sitting next to the president, I hope, is very grateful that your book includes that French voice, because her two parents both witnessed the D-Day, 9 and 10 years old, in their respective villages behind Utah Beach. Her father being in San Marcouf, which was where the most casualties French were on D-Day. So Mag is always very grateful that your book highlights the French experience, because not to be propelled beyond that of the Allies, but included among the Allies, because the French civilians are part of it as well from a different point of view. So thank you on behalf of Mag for telling that story.
Well, it's been a great pleasure to be on. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Brilliant, Brad. So, folks, I'll be back again in an hour and a quarter's time with Neil. This is coming on to talk about the 91st Division. I'm going to meet a friend and have some lunch now. Thank you very much for watching us. There's other competing coverage of D-Day going on, but you're here on World War II TV, and I'm very grateful. So, thanks, Giles. Thanks, viewers. See you all in a little bit later in the afternoon. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Okay.